The conflict in Ukraine continues, and as it does, there have been some interesting geopolitical developments, and there is continuous geopolitical theater taking place, and I would like to sort them out for you. I want to point out something that I found very interesting. This was brought to my attention by Alexander Mikuris of the Duran. He covered this in a recent video of his. This is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, February 9, 2026. Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov's interview with BRICS TV, BRICS, International Media Network. And he says many interesting things, but the thing that I thought that was most interesting was his repeated reference to the US and its pursuit of domination, economic domination. The West is reluctant to relinquish its formerly dominant positions, domination over the energy sector, dominance of the dollar. What Minister Lavrov is saying is the United States still seeks domination. It seeks domination, and everything that it does is driven by this desire for domination. This is what I said over a year ago, even before the 2024 elections were held and before President Trump won those elections and took office. I warned that there is only one single US geopolitical objective. It is global domination. It wants to eliminate all rivals and consolidate control over the planet. Everything it has done for decades, regardless of whether you had a Democratic president, a Republican president, a Congress, regardless of which party controlled it, this was the singular pursuit of US foreign policy, and even to a degree, domestic policy. Domestic policy is shaped by this foreign policy objective. That was the case all the way back in 1992, when the New York Times reported on this. Following the end of the Cold War, US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop, and it continues to this very day, which is what Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is talking about in this interview. What Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is talking about is that there can be no negotiations with the United States. In essence, he did not say this blatantly, but in essence, what he is saying is you cannot negotiate with a country that just simply wants to dominate you and is using negotiations to weaken your hand, to weaken you, and in essence, subordinate you to them. Russia finds this unacceptable. Why is Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov saying this now and to TV BRICS? Why is he saying this now? And I think it is because, and I've said this many times, people wondered why is Russian President Vladimir Putin continuously negotiating with the United States, knowing what they did all the way back in 2014 and with the Minsk agreements that the US made and broke twice, and now we see them doing this all over again. Why is Russia falling for this? Again, Russia was never falling for this. As many analysts have pointed out, Russia has never made any concessions at all whatsoever to the United States during these negotiations. They are simply having these negotiations. When you hear Russian President Vladimir Putin or various spokespeople heaping praise onto President Trump and the United States, they are doing this to construct an exit ramp for the US to use as Russia continues pursuing and winning the war in Ukraine. So that said, this is Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov telling you right now, confirming what I had been telling people even before the 2024 election. The US has no interest in ending this war. Doesn't matter who won the election. They have no interest in ending the war. They will continue fighting it as a proxy war. They don't care if Ukraine wins or loses. They knew that Ukraine was almost certainly going to lose. I've shown you the Rand Corporation paper from 2019 extending Russia many times, where they admit you can provoke a war with Russia. It will be very costly for Russia, but it will cost Ukraine almost certainly its existence. They know that. They don't care. They are fighting this war for as long as possible to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia and to create conditions within which the US can degrade Russia. Is this a war directly between the US and Russia, and that is it? Or does it fit into a larger geopolitical context? And the answer is yes, it fits into a larger geopolitical context. The US, again, going all the way back to 1992, no rivals are allowed. No rivals can develop. The first and foremost rival the US worries about and is desperate to encircle and contain is China. Eliminating Russia is a prerequisite to isolating and eliminating China. So is Iran. That is why people who are hallucinating the prospects of the US ever negotiating in good faith with either Russia or Iran toward any sort of diplomatic settlement, this is why they're delusional. This will never happen. Unless the US changes its mind about encircling and containing China, which it will never do, it will continue pursuing its proxy wars and direct war with both Russia and Iran. And so people who are saying, oh, President Trump, he wants to negotiate with Iran, and we have the Israeli Benjamin Netanyahu, he's coming over to convince President Trump to abandon diplomacy and attack. The decision to attack Iran was already made decades ago. As soon as Iran threw the American puppet regime out in the 1970s, the US was determined to reverse that. And that is what they have been pursuing ever since. And that is what the Trump administration right now is presiding over. They're not making these decisions. They happen to be the political face of continuity of agenda right now at this point in time. And by the way, President Trump was negotiating with Iran the last time the US physically and literally militarily attacked Iran, just last year. So how many times are people going to fall for this? They're not negotiating in good faith. The negotiations are to give the US plausible deniability, to give them a pretext to continuously justify this in the eyes of the Western public and the global public to a certain extent. So that is one. I think it's very interesting and important to understand that Russia is now openly saying this. As Alexander Mercouris pointed out, it's not President Putin pointing this out. It's Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov pointing this out. So it's still, in a way, it's the truth is out there. And more so for the multipolar world to see. Russia is not falling for this again. They understand what is going on, and they have a plan and a strategy to manage this. They're not going to fall for Minsk 3.0. People should not worry about that. That's how I feel. I agree. I feel this is a message that Russia wants to put out, but not have President Putin put it out there himself, because that definitively ends any prospect of even the semblance, the facade of negotiations. Next, this theater is ramping up again. The Munich Defense Conference. Trump's world order hangs over Europe on eve of key defense conference. And they have this picture from last year where US Vice President J.D. Vance was slamming Europe to everybody's delight. Oh, Europe, liberal Europe, they're so horrible. And here comes conservative J.D. Vance to put them in their place. Except everything Vice President J.D. Vance said to Europe was said in absolute, almost mockingly, hypocrisy. The U.S. has no free speech. The U.S. has a massive self-inflicted immigration problem. It itself created. It itself is still creating. President Trump just oversaw the attack on Venezuela, the kidnapping of its president, and now they're plundering Venezuela's oil wealth. What do you think is going to happen to those people and people in the region as the U.S. continues to ravage Latin America the same way they have for over a century, which has caused all of these people to leave the region to North America in the first place? Okay, so J.D. Vance was saying this for public consumption. It had no meaning in terms of geopolitics, any sort of direction the U.S. was actually going in. And first and foremost, it was said to sell the U.S.-European split, which is an absolute, utter, and utterly confirmed fiction. And so you have the BBC playing its role to sell this fiction of a U.S.-European split. And this is a split the Munich Security Conference this year is going to try to depict as growing out of control. Except we know already, and I have pointed this out many, many times since this was laid out in February last year, a year ago. Opening remarks by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. He was talking to Europe. He said, US isn't going to abandon Europe. There's going to be a division of labor with Europe. The US cannot fight China and Russia all on its own. It needs its proxies to step up and make a greater sacrifice. And in this directive he delivered to Europe, that Europe has since obediently and in every single way fulfilled, he tells Europe, you need to convince your public that this needs to happen, that Europe needs to make sacrifices to continue fighting this US proxy war on Russia. The whole war in Ukraine is a US conflict created and perpetuated by the US and the US alone. It has forced Europe to play a central role in it at Europe's expense. But it is a US war, and it is telling Europe, you are going to step in. As Ukraine crumbles, you will step in and you will perpetuate this conflict at great cost to yourself, and you need to sell to the European public why this needs to be done. And to enhance your ability to do that, we will create a US-European split that makes it look like the US is abandoning Europe and Europe has no choice. It is existential that they continue this fight alone, even though the US, even to this day, still oversees virtually every aspect of what is taking place in and around Ukraine, and is itself carrying out strikes on Russia, deep inside Russian territory, on Russian oil tankers all around the world, simply passing it through Ukraine, claiming that it's Ukraine carrying out these attacks. It is the US Central Intelligence Agency doing that. That is confirmed, again, by the New York Times. Now, how do we know? One last thing. I want to get back to Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and these admissions that the US is pursuing domination, global domination, and resolving this diplomatically is extremely unlikely. People wonder, is this Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov saying this all on his own, separate from the thoughts and policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin? I want to direct your attention to this, again, from the Kremlin website. And this is an interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin all the way back in 2017. The question: you have mentioned the United States. The allegations of Russian interference in the US presidential race raised a political storm in Washington. Similar allegations were also voiced in France. What is your response, especially against the backdrop of recent developments in the US? And of course, it doesn't matter who wins the US presidential election. I've warned people about this many times. In fact, every single presidential administration that I have been an adult and has witnessed, except for 2000, when the first and last time I voted for a US president, it was I realize it is a facade. It doesn't matter who you vote for. Continuity of agenda continues, hence continuity of agenda. Here's what Russian President Vladimir Putin said all the way back in 2017. I've already spoken to 3 US presidents. They come and go, but politics stays the same all the time. That sure sounds like continuity of agenda to me. Do you know why? Because of the powerful bureaucracy, the deep state, if you want to call it that. When a person is elected, they may have some ideas. I think he's being charitable. I don't think they have any ideas, especially President Trump. He thinks the S in BRICS is Spain. He thinks Thailand is pronounced Thailand. The man is a buffoon. He knows nothing about what's going on around the world. There is no way multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that actually run foreign and domestic US policy would allow this man to unilaterally make decisions on his own. He's a loud distraction that they have put into place to distract, divide, and keep the public occupied while continuity of agenda continues marching forward to the detriment of everybody in American and global society. Let's continue. When a person is elected, they may have some ideas. Then people with briefcases arrive, well dressed, wearing dark suits just like mine, except for the red tie, since they wear black or dark blue ones. These people start explaining how things are done, and instantly everything changes. This is what happens with every administration, whether it was President Trump coming into office then, his second term in office, President Biden, President Obama, President Bush Jr., doesn't matter. multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations run US foreign and domestic policy. They also run European foreign and domestic policy. The whole idea of a US-European split is such an absurd fiction, because if you look at Europe, if there really was some sort of split, and there really were two divergent camps of special interests having some sort of conflict with one another, the Europeans would be cultivating leverage against the Americans, and instead they have eagerly surrendered it, not just surrendered it in general, but surrendered it to the United States specifically. The decision to cut off Russian energy imports by 2027, and thus surrendering themselves to dependency on US liquid natural gas imports, is exactly that. They would not have done that if there was a genuine US-European split. And so people need to wake up to the first principles reality, the material realities of what is happening, and ignore the political rhetoric that is designed specifically to distract you away from those realities. Understand that this conflict in Ukraine is going to continue. There will be no diplomatic settlement. It will be settled on the battlefield by Russia. Russia will either continue and finish this on their own terms, or they won't, but it will be determined on the battlefield, just like events were determined in Syria, which unfortunately for Russia was to the detriment of their best interests in Ukraine. And this was a calculation by Russia. They concentrated resources specifically to ensure victory in Ukraine, even if it came at the expense of losing in Syria. And a similar conflict, similar dynamics are shaping what is to come regarding Iran. The US will almost certainly go to war with Iran again. It is guaranteed there will be no diplomatic settlement. The US has no interest in a diplomatic settlement. Diplomatic negotiations with Iran are a facade. It is a distraction. It is something that they have used already to carry out military strikes against Iran. They are doing the exact same thing again. And as far as China goes, the first and foremost center of US geopolitical objectives to dominate the planet is to encircle, contain, and eliminate China. There is no plan to coexist with China. People need to understand this. If you understand this, you will see through all of this theater, you will see articles like this, and you will see that they are selling you a fiction, a US-European split, when the US has long since subordinated Europe to its interests. Everything Europe does is to its own detriment and for the benefit of America. Why would they do that unless they were subordinated to the Americans? And if you look at the powerful special interests that shape the United States, their influence over Europe, and the special interests in Europe that might be tempted to pursue an alternative path, they are dwarfed by those American interests operating and controlling markets and politics and media all across Europe. So that is the material reality, and that is what's going to shape what is to come. Ignore the political rhetoric. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov also said something else very interesting, and I don't want to go on and on and on, but he was, the very last topic they talked about was artificial intelligence, and he was talking about how AI will be used by nations integrated with their military forces all around the globe. And he never mentioned the nation's name, but he is saying some nations are trying to use this to subordinate others to them. And of course, he's talking about the United States. I have an entire article and a video coming up on artificial intelligence. It is one of several that I will be putting out over the next couple of weeks, maybe month or two. And until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, X, and on Telegram. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not doing me any good at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Again, the links for those will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare at all, and all you can do is share, like, post a kind comment, send a news tip. All of this is greatly appreciated. All of this together helps make this work possible. I thank you sincerely, and as always, I thank you for watching.